you very much. I hope you can all hear me. First of all, I'd like to say how much I enjoyed the exhibition, and I hope you've all seen it by now. I think it's the most beautiful exhibition, and I was quite moved when I first saw it because it's the most identifiable exhibition I've ever seen, personal to Sydney. We all relate to it. It felt like being with the family. And although we all love to come and see exhibitions like Picasso and the wonders of Europe and America, this is us. It encompasses you. Got lovely little chills up and down my spine seeing everything. So if you haven't seen it, you better go down and see it after this. And also I commend the catalogue, which is gorgeous, and you'll keep looking at it, unlike other catalogues which you buy excitedly at the exhibition and then you go home and you don't often look at them, or that's what happens to me. This one is really fantastic. And the shop has got wonderful stuff, all sorts of modern designs. I bought some socks a couple of weeks ago and have been wearing them ever since. I'm not wearing them tonight. And people stop me, where did you get those socks? So I commend them to you. Now, why am I here? That's what I wanted to know when they asked me to speak. I had the vague impression I was on a panel, and then I read it a bit closer and I discovered it was me. And I thought, why have they asked me? And then I thought about it a bit more, and I think it's age. It's age. I'm part of it. I'm part of it. I was born before the war, just before the war. And, you know, when you get to my age, you can remember things that happened a long way back. And as I look around the audience, well, there's probably a few my age, but there's a lot of you, most of you are a lot younger than me. And I'm part of history. It's amazing. You just grow up and history's right there before you. And I suppose when I thought about it, yes, I have had an interesting life and I have been involved in the arts in many different ways. So I'm going to run through a little bit of that for you. First of all, I'd like to say that Daniel Thomas, who was a great friend of ours, he came to be the first curator at this art gallery. Believe it or not, the first curator. They'd never had one before. In 1950, where have I put it down? 1958. The year we were married, actually, and we met him almost immediately and became firm friends. And Harry and he and I had a very good relationship, and he used to talk about all the artists, and he was the one who really bought most of the significant number of the paintings downstairs. They didn't really. He bought the Sock Knitter by Grace Cothington Smith, which is attributed to be the first post-impressionist painting from Australia. And he started buying all these paintings, a lot of women artists, of course. And somehow we were involved with that. He used to have Saturday lunches, and so did we. And we used to visit each other, and there were always artists and talk about art. And so those names became very familiar to me. And for very little money in those days, you could buy anything for 50 guineas, you know. There wasn't much of a market. And the art gallery didn't have any of that stuff at the time. So a tribute to Daniel Thomas, who was here at the opening of Sydney Moderns. He's got a prologue in the catalogue, which you should all read too. And he's still alive, living in Tasmania, where he originally came from. And I think this gallery owes a huge debt to him for rediscovering all the important artists that relate to our time. Now, my own art education was not significant. In the days when I went to school in the 50s, art was a dropout subject. People who had some sort of, who wished to have an academic career did not study art because it didn't count for the matriculation. And there might have been art where you could learn to draw or do a bit of painting or something, but they didn't teach art history or art appreciation in those days. That came about much later. We had art at home. My mother and my father hadn't necessarily studied art, but they were interested in art. My mother was a bit of a victim of the Sydney Charm School. She liked Adrian Faint, who is represented in the gallery. We had some of those at home, but he's more renowned as a book engraver these days. And my father used to tell me about coming to visit this gallery. He was born in 1900. He used to come and visit this gallery, and the work that he remembers most significantly is Sons of Clovis, which you'll see back there somewhere, painted by the French artist Luminet, and it's a very powerful piece, and I commend it to you. So, although I knew the name Grace Cossington Smith and Margaret Preston, etc., oh yes, there was the Wurrunga artists, the Turramurra artists, I think they were, of which Grace Cossington Smith was a member, of course, and another artist called, what was it? No, it wasn't Grace Crowley. Anyway, painted my mother. My mother didn't like the painting so much. Now it's hanging in the New England Gallery. It's a beautiful painting. I wish it was part of the family. My father at one stage was Minister for Education in the state government here, and at that time he appointed my aunt Mary Alice Evatt, the wife of Dr. Herbert Evatt, to be a trustee of this gallery, the first woman trustee. Of course, he got a lot of flack because of nepotism, which was true. However, she was a very good trustee. She was educated in art. They knew Picasso, of course, and she had studied in New York with, can't remember the name, significant. However, she was an excellent trustee. So I'm proud of that, even though it was nepotism. Now, it's interesting that I thought that the exhibition, my impression was that it was largely women. And I did a bit of a count on that, and it's not really. There are 56 artists, of which 23 are women. That's not bad, actually, not bad, really. And I think maybe the women are more represented in the number of paintings. But it is very interesting for that time, because Grace Cossington Smith and Margaret Preston were all born in the late 19th century. And the where is this piece of paper? Four major women artists, Grace Cossington Smith, Margaret Preston, Grace Crowley, and Thea Proctor. None of them married. And of course, you can imagine why, because the First World War culled off all the young men. They came from upper middle class family, and one wonders how different it would have been if they had married and had families. Maybe they still would have been great artists, but I think they had the means. They all travelled to Europe. They all studied in England or Europe, and they had leisure. They seemed to have some sort of independent income, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to live in such an elegant way, I think. And we must remember the great loss of the First World War. My father's two next elder brothers were both killed in the First World War. And there were so many women at that time who were never to marry and never have children because of that terrible event. So, I was very fortunate when I went to Sydney University and studied architecture to be taught art and art history by Lloyd Rees, who was inspirational. I remember every word he told us about art history. And as I stand in front of the great paintings in the world, his words come back to me. We were very fortunate to have him. He was a wonderful man. But the other artist who taught us was Roland Wakelin. Amazingly enough, he must have been pretty old then. I'm talking about the early 60s. And he sort of dotted around, and I don't think he thought much of my stuff, but he used to talk about Cézanne a lot. That was his favourite artist. And when I see his fabulous paintings down there, the Berries Bay and the Flower Cellar at Farm Cove, and to think I didn't revere him so much in those days, I feel quite humbled actually. There he was teaching young kids who didn't know anything about him, and he was a great artist. Lloyd Rees too, but I think we revered him more because he gave us such wonderful, exquisite art history lectures. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about me and my family, but the one person I haven't mentioned yet is my husband, Harry Seidler, who came to Australia in 1948. And rather reluctantly, I might add, he didn't ever see himself ending up in Australia. He had been living in New York for some time and felt he was at the cutting edge of everything and working for a great architect, Marcel Breuer, and he'd been fabulously well educated under Gropius at Harvard and studied with Albers at Black Mountain College, and you name it, he'd done it. And his parents had emigrated to Australia, and they finally persuaded him to come to build a house, which is now known as the Rose Seidler House. And I'm wearing a little lapel pin about which shows it too. And so he came to Australia. He was 25 and immediately got involved with the Contemporary Art Society and gave lectures. He hit the ground running, spreading the word of modern architecture, of course. And I have some interesting, he kept a scrapbook of press cuttings, and I'm going to read you out some of these things because I think it's quite interesting. These were written 60 years ago. Makes me feel a bit old too. I was a schoolgirl at the time, but but it is amazing. This is a review of a contemporary art exhibition which was held in Sydney. This year's exhibition of the Contemporary Art Society presents itself curiously like a snare for the unwary. In this tortuous maze artificially created to change the dreary proportions of the education department, there lurks a Kafka-like fear reaching its climax in a set of wire traps terrifying if unbaited. It goes on. Then it says, the section of architecture, sculpture and abstract art alone lends a measure of stability, because before that it had decried it. And in the architecture it says the exponents here are Harry Seidler, Douglas Snelling and Budden Mannon are to be encouraged, it says, are to be encouraged. And then it says, among the abstract painters, one discovered a more marked degree of subtlety and variation within a limited aspect. One may mention the work of Tom Bass, J.B. Mason, Frank Hinder, Grace Crowley, Ralph Borson, and Kay Harrison. among representational painters, Desiderius Orban, Sidney Nolan, Francis Limburger, and James Gleeson. Well, I won't read you the whole thing, but it says at the end, by our art reviewer, and it says the exhibition will be opened at 3 p.m. today. The openings were always during the day then, because in those days nobody lived in the city, they all lived in the suburbs, and the exhibitions were at lunchtime usually, so I suppose people in the city could wander up. That was 1949. Now this one, I presume, is 1949 too. Both contemporary, Harry was a member of the Contemporary Art Society. An unusual scheme for displaying the pictures of the Contemporary Art Society's exhibition at Education Department Gallery received favourable comment from the record crowd of people at the opening yesterday. Young American architect Harry Seidler planned the layout of pictures. Then it's got a paragraph and it says, both men and women guests at the opening wore cool summer clothes to withstand the heat of the 6th floor glass-roofed gallery. Secretary of the Contemporary Art Society, Mrs. Margot Lewis, who is represented in the exhibition downstairs, who exhibited a number of her abstract paintings, wore a cool scarlet and white silk frock with a white organdy collar. She attended with her sculptor husband, Gerald Francis, and daughter Tanya. And Tanya is actually in my year doing architecture at Sydney University. Clytie Lloyd-Jones, who exhibited 2 paintings, wore an attractive full-skirted black and white taffeta frock with a black jersey bodice. Taking a special interest in modern designs for domestic and industrial architecture was Mrs. Gertrude Herzke, who studied industrial design at the Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany, a couple of years ago. Other women artists present were Grace Crowley, Alison Rayfish, whose husband, George Duncan, managed the show. Artist Vera Rudner, who attended with her husband, wore a tailored black grosgrain suit with a jockey cap of powder grosgrain. Well, it seems a long time ago. I mean, I can't believe it. That's the way it was then. I think we've come a long way since then. The writer is not mentioned. They never mentioned the journalists in those days. They just put from a foreign correspondent or the art reviewer or something. And I want to tell you about another exhibition which was held at Macquarie Galleries in 1952, which is 61 years ago. Paintings by Ralph Balson, who's of course represented quite a lot in the exhibition. Paintings by Ralph Balson, constructions by Robert Klippel, opened by Harry Seidler, who gave the opening address. He was 29 then, and that was on Wednesday the 21st of May 1952 at 1 p.m. And I used to look through these things and I said, Harry, why didn't you buy some of Ralph Balson's paintings? They sell for hundreds of thousands now. And, he said, well, I thought, he'd come from New York. He was a real aesthetic snob, I might add. I mean, he came here and he said, it was just a faint echo of what was happening internationally, just a faint echo. He said they were all very nice people, but I just didn't think it was up to, well, maybe it wasn't. We were far away then. Things have changed now, electronic communications. But he was certainly in the swim then, and of course when he finished the house for his mother and it won the Sulman Award in 1952, he was extremely well known. He became like the architect that people had heard of. And it was because he preached it. He was a preacher. He wanted the world to know about it. And that's why he was well known. I'm not sure people said, he was a great publicist. Well, I suppose he was, but it was all about spreading the word. And I met him in 1957. I was a teenager. And we married at the end of 1958. I got married on my 20th birthday, actually. And had a very interesting life, and of course, lots of good things, lots of not so good things, but always art was in there. As I said, Daniel Thomas was a very good friend of ours. We used to ask him, now, who are the artists that you would think would go well in a contemporary house that Harry was designing? And he would always come up. I remember him recommending Frank Hodgkinson, John Coburn, and Peter Upwood, of course. Peter Upwood, who's not represented downstairs, but who's represented back there. Harry opened his exhibition in 1962, and we did buy it, that one. I think it cost 30 guineas. And fabulous thing. And he was the most gorgeous, gorgeous artist in the world. Unfortunately, later on became addicted to drugs and died prematurely. But his work sells now in the hundreds of thousands. All go and look up Peter Upwood, he's fabulous. Now, what else can I tell you? I'm looking at my watch. I think it's time we could have questions if anybody would like to ask a question.
Do you think art influenced your architecture, or how do you think it does in general?
Well, I think art and architecture move hand in hand, and one without the other is not good. When we placed art in buildings, it was always right at the inception of the work, and very much a joint collaboration with artists. We worked with artists who did commissions for our buildings, and I think the best architecture in the world has art that identifies with it. It's not just stuck on after. It all goes together, it's all of one era. And when you get a significant historical building, it has the art of its time in it. I'm not talking about an art museum, of course, that's quite a different thing. But it's nice to see a time capsule of a particular period. And that's why in our own house, apart from very small areas, it's all the original art which came. The house was built in 1967, and by the early 70s we'd filled up all the prominent places, and they're not going to change. It's frozen there. It's a time capsule of that period.